I'm gonna throw a lot of stuff at you today, if time permits, going from like why do the terms economics and biodiversity losses even fit in the same title? That doesn't go without some explanations. And talk about like if we agree that there is something for economists to say about the biodiversity crisis, what are some of the inherent challenges for making inferences in that space? And then try to connect some of those dots with three short examples from my work. So just starting off with what is the statement about the problem here, why are we so concerned about biodiversity loss? The key reason is that our colleagues in the natural sciences are telling us that we're losing species left and right, that biodiversity is in free fall, that extinction rates are conservatively 100 to 1,000 times higher than what they think are the normal background levels. They are also concerned that they're seeing these extinction rates across many, if not all, of the different taxonomic groups, and the idea that like an extinction begets an extinction with if a host species goes extinct, whatever was dependent on that species is also likely going to become extinct. If you heard about the perils of the monarch butterfly in the US, it's not so much that the monarch butterfly is in trouble, so much as that the plant that it relies on for its habitat, the milkweed, we just cannot keep enough of it growing in enough places for the monarch butterfly to have enough habitat to live in. But even before we get concerned about the events of a global extinction of a species, we are even much more concerned about what is the role that species can fill in their local ecosystem, and that starts to deteriorate as soon as abundance levels start to go down. And well before there's a global extinction, there's going to be a local extinction in a certain ecosystem or biome. And well before there's a local extinction, there's going to be what ecologists call a functional extinction. You still have some of that species around, but they're just a mere shadow of what they used to be, and they're no longer capable of carrying out their role. Ecologists have, for years, in a similar way to how climate scientists have warned us about climate change, have been ringing the alarm bells by saying that, like, look, these changes in ecosystem functioning and biodiversity levels might actually have very dire consequences and severe impacts on humanity and human well-being and what we as economists think of as welfare. They've been writing these big review articles, they've been pointing as to all of these different mechanisms and theoretical foundations as to why they think there might be such a negative impact. But we've, in a way, been playing a bit of catch-up to climate change. There's been only one report by IPBES, which is sort of equivalent to IPCC, from which we've had 6 reports already. So we're just like have a lot more to learn. But as a result, to many people in social sciences, including in energy and environmental economics, there's still a very much open question as to why at all should any of this map to human well-being. Where do we actually see these outcomes that we care about as social scientists respond to changes in ecosystem functioning? To frame this through the lens of a production function, for a very long time in economics, we worried mostly about labor and land in the production, usually of some agricultural commodity. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we cared less about land as the limiting binding constraint, and started more to worry about human-made capital, labor, and the complementarities that they have. There are these recent concerns now that maybe it's time to reintroduce nature into the production function and think about exactly what kind of outcomes are going to be dependent on nature that are relevant for human well-being. To what degree can human-made capital substitute for natural inputs and capital? What are some of the trade-offs of increasing output or utility and having natural inputs around? How can policy actually move the needle on having more or less of natural inputs? And how do incentives actually make it such that it's more worthwhile or help promote the preservation of natural inputs? Or what kind of incentive structures actually promote the erosion of natural inputs? You might be surprised to know that, you might be surprised maybe that we don't have full answers to all of these questions. It is perhaps less surprising to know just how many things that we might take for granted about our understanding of the natural world are quite recent. We did not know for many centuries that it's even possible for a species to go extinct. That had to dawn on us as a consensus point around 1796, we had to rediscover that birds migrate in the winter, putting an end to the debate about whether they're hibernating in the ocean or hibernating on the moon. Okay? And concepts like trophic cascades and biological diversity are just like decade old. And we don't have a full agreement as to what is the total number of species on planet Earth, but we do understand that we have not come anywhere close to documenting and cataloging all of them. So with that, there's a lot of open questions about what is the impact of biodiversity losses on human well-being. With that though, there's a lot more growing attention to this idea that policymakers should be paying more attention to this. Countries have pledged that they're going to effectively double the amount of protected areas to 30% by 2030. There's no first order condition or scientific basis to why 30% or why by 2030. Those numbers just align well, so easy to sign up to that. It used to be the case, at least up until recently, that agencies in the US had to agree to start taking into account in their benefit cost analysis the concept of ecosystem services. While that might be less true now in the United States, at least other countries are also stepping up their game in terms of accounting for biodiversity losses, where firms in China are going to have to start disclose what are the impacts that their production has on biodiversity as part of the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. I wish them the best of luck with figuring that out. That is by no means an easy question to answer and disclose. I don't think that the firms themselves have a good understanding of that. So to kind of give you a broad overview as to what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk a bit about the justification for why economists should have a voice in this conversation, what are some of the challenges of making inferences in this space and other environmental problems, and instead of a variety of topics, I'll probably just show you 3 examples. Okay, so to start this intellectual historical journey in the literature, I want to start with this paper by Kotila from 1967. It is not the first, it is not the only paper that talks about what is the proper valuation scheme for nature, but it is an important one because it makes the point that there are use benefits and values that we get from directly harvesting fish, from directly enjoying pollination from bees and so on, but we also have these non-use benefits from species that we're never going to enjoy, we're never even going to go and see in the wild, but we care about them existing. The common example people will give is polar bears or panda bears, and I don't know exactly what my valuation is, but I can say that it's not 0 on them surviving. The point of the paper is that those valuations might be very, very small for each specific species, for each human valuing them, but aggregated across all those preferences over a large pool of people, they might actually be a large enough number. The key challenge with that approach that remains though is how do we find out what are these existence values or what are these intrinsic values that people have for the existence of polar bears. So if you go to a paper from 1947 that suggested, as again, this idea of people have value on things that we're never going to see, enjoy, or benefit from, wasn't thought of in 1967. And this paper talks about maybe you should just ask people how they value, just what we'd call stated preferences versus revealed preferences. Very hard to get people to reveal what it is that they actually ascribe as value to those species, but we can ask them and see what it is that they state about those preferences. That literature has not been without some controversy. And so if we go to this Journal of Economics Perspectives issue from 1994, kind of pitching these 2 camps of is there any value to stated preferences and the use of contingent valuation methods to learn about them? Those in one corner say yes, under some conditions, in some settings, this makes theoretical and empirical sense. The other camp is these never rise up to the occasion of measuring the preferences that they're attempting to measure. Fast forward to 2012, in the corner of contingent valuation, they're making the argument that we have made so much advances theoretically and empirically, we've gotten so much better at this. On the other side of the aisle, A complete loss of hope that any of this is sensible, saying that essentially people are just making up on the fly numbers without anchoring them to anything that's real. This entire exercise is completely dead on arrival. I'm spending a bit of time on contingent evaluation and telling you about it because I do think that we do learn one key takeaway from that broad literature, is that people care a lot about preventing species from going extinct. They very much have these aversions for species completely disappearing off the global stage. That high willingness to pay for preserving some viable population so the species doesn't go extinct falls sharply as soon as you ask them how many is the optimal number or the right number we need to have of that species. In other words, people want to know that polar bears exist. They have absolutely no clue how to state the correct number of polar bears that should exist. I think there's a bit more that can be done with these type of methods, combined with kind of like the advent of the credibility revolution in economics, where you have all these natural experiments that sharply change the local abundance of species, and there's scope to running these surveys and asking people about what they value nature now that their exposure to a certain species has gone either sharply up or sharply down, which is an idea that I owe to Mark Conte. And surveys are sort of like, seeing this resurgence in economics. They're back in fashion. Stephanie Sadventure just received the Clark Bates Medal, so this is recognized and cherished by the field as like important work. Maybe there's more that we can take from these methods also to these types of questions. So that's one valuation scheme to think about how to value nature. Ask people what it is they think the value is, and hope that they're not making up numbers. A completely different one deals with the notion that we don't know everything there is to know about the world and the value the species provide us right now, or the value that they might provide us in the future. And there's a lot of different economic development actions that we can take today that might make it irreversible, such that we no longer can benefit from those species. If there's high uncertainty as to what the benefits are, and development ends up being irreversible, maybe we should delay such development. This is used broadly in the literature that talks about the justification for biodiversity conservation as this idea of like option value, or like keeping options alive, as this World Resources Institute report says. And there are some good reasons as to why in real time we might be underestimating or missing the point about a specific species. Maybe technology has not yet evolved, so there's like an actual benefit that can be derived from that species. Maybe we need new evidence and we just like haven't taken the time to document the benefits. Or maybe like it's just that conditions about our society have not developed yet or matured yet for that species to generate value. I'm providing here just like one, I think like, I wouldn't say there are many, but this is like a very clear example where this like prehistoric animal, the horseshoe crab, it is not a horse, it is not a shoe, it is not a crab, yet that is his name, and has been around for a very long time, and we have not benefited from it in any meaningful way other than maybe catching it and eating it. Still happens a bit in the mid-Atlantic region. But once we developed vaccines, the blood of the horseshoe crab became massively important because we test for contaminations in large batches of vaccines by introducing a bit of the blood of the horseshoe crab, because it has a somewhat primitive, aggressive, overreactive immune system that at the presence of any contamination, any bacteria, will just go berserk. So it makes it very easy if something's in the sample that shouldn't be. So we, for a very long time now, have been taking out these animals from the ocean, bleeding them not dry, but harvesting a good amount of their blood, throwing them back in the ocean, thinking that they're going to survive. At best, maybe 50 of them do. And countries in the EU have since shifted to a synthetic substitute. The US has not adopted it, but this is like an example of this crab used to like have almost like zero value to us, went to like being incredibly valuable, and might not, not be as valuable because of a human-made substitute. These different evaluation schemes, as you probably said this earlier, are all different ways that economists are musing about why and how we should measure value for nature. There's a broader philosophical debate about whether that is even morally desired or repugnant or not of an exercise. Whether ascribing a dollar value to ecosystems and species is something that we should not do whatsoever. I'm of the view that if we don't participate in that exercise, we're not necessarily going to place an implicit value that's infinite. We're much more likely to place an implicit value of zero, and relative to some opportunity cost, where juxtaposing yet another county subdivision versus some monarch butterfly habitat, how do we make those comparisons? It also is useful to point out that here, for example, the idea that this under this specific valuation scheme, the value of the horseshoe crab is going down over time because we're able to substitute for it. So some of these arguments might if that is the only valuation scheme that we think is useful to think about the value of nature, it might spell that the value of nature is going to go down over time, and that is completely independent from other arguments that even if we have zero benefits that we're drawing from the environment or ecosystems or species, we have a responsibility. We need to be good stewards of the environment, and such that it doesn't go extinct on us, and we preserve something for future generations. And those are not that economists think that those are wrong or that we can say something about it. Economists don't think that they have a comparative advantage in those type of discussions. Okay, so a very specific example of value developing over time is this field called bioprospecting. There are many different pharmaceutical drugs and treatments that started out by a mistake, by noticing some compound derived from nature responds in one way or another to some bacteria or fungal pathogen or something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that that exact nature-derived compound ends up in an ointment or a pill, but it provides a very useful lead for then to be a lot of additional investigation and permutations around that chemical compound until that patent and drug becomes available. There's a big question is how do we think of the size of the library and the usefulness of the library in that type of genetic variation, and how much of it should we preserve? If we think now there are all of these different treatments to treat cancer that have been derived from sharks, how do you exactly place value on that? The counterarguing argument to this is that similarly to value declining over time, we can think that with the arrival of if we figure out quantum computing and we don't actually need the genetic library to tell us what these different compounds are, we can just have a simulation run and produce all of the different, if AlphaFold becomes so incredibly good, it might come up with all the different permutations that we need and tell us exactly what the solution is, and the value of the library is going to converge to zero. And so that is again, if this is the only way that we're thinking about the valuation of nature, that might be problematic for those trade-offs. A completely different lens that we've touched on a little is really focusing on the role of substitution. So Salo wrote this big piece that's saying look, there are these human-made substitutes that can complement or substitute completely these natural inputs that we have, and we can keep production more or less the same. As long as they exist, as long as they're not prohibitively expensive, as long as they don't cause their own set of problems, this looks like a pretty straightforward way towards how we as economists should be thinking about sustainability. But I think that all of those conditions are exactly stating potentially what are different mechanisms that reveal the value of nature to us. Those substitutions need to exist. They don't always do. They sometimes exist, but they are very, very expensive, depending on the substitute and the setting you might want to apply them in. And they might, just because you're using one of these substitutes doesn't mean that it's not causing its own set of problems that we need to be worried about. More on this point much later in the talk. But I want to tell you about like the success story that everyone celebrates as like, substitution for the win. Who needs nature? We got this. And the story goes somewhere along like the mid 90s in this region in China that was reliant on small scale apple orchards. And for a variety of different reasons, bees just like collapsed. Okay? Or like it's not that they went completely extinct, but they were definitely no longer pollinating to the same degree that they were before. Farmers were like, okay, what do we do? Do we just like tear the trees up and plant something else? No, they started to manually pollinate, and because they were pollinating every single flower on every single tree, yields went up by like 30-40%. That was great. That was like, who needs bees when we can like increase yields by 40%? And they were lazy, they were like shirking on the job, good riddance. But this was possible because we're talking about very small scale operations, something that was done by the owner of the plot, maybe assisted by their neighbors. This is by no means, I think, the recipe for success, for example, for almond operations in California, which are also highly dependent on pollination. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have some other forms of substitution coming for bees. Okay, if automation is coming for all jobs, you can bet it's also coming for the jobs of different insects and bees, either in the form of like, these macro robots just going around, driving around the plot, spraying pollen around, or these like tiny insects, essentially like building drones the size of a penny and the weight of a paperclip that are meant to essentially mimic what bees do in terms of pollination. These are all in relatively early stages. I don't know yet of like a commercial application of these technologies, but it's drawing a lot of attention. The fact that there are multiple labs and multiple institutions working on this tells you that there's a lot of funding to, automate and substitute for bees, and at what point or another it's going to happen. Okay, a completely different kind of like left field way to think about how we should think about the value of biodiversity is say, okay, it's really hard to measure what the benefits that animals provide, but we can measure something about their evolutionary history. And we can focus really about the evolutionary distinctiveness. Okay, so there's like two different papers that kind of like make the same point about if a species had a very unique evolutionary history, it branched off some common ancestor millions of years ago, doesn't have a lot of like other genetic relatives. Losing that species matters more than losing some subspecies of sparrows, for example. Okay, that's the approach that this paper argues. What I specifically like about this paper, and is part of like my origin story in graduate school, is that reading this as a graduate student, somewhere along the lines of developing like the punchline argument about evolutionary distinctiveness, Weitzman introduces this like objective function of maximizing utility from direct benefits and non-direct benefits, which is like an expected utility function because there are these survival probabilities, and the policy is that you can increase survival probabilities with some conservation effort, which has a cost. You have a conservation budget, and this all becomes an exercise. It's like, where do you spend your conservation dollars? Which survival probabilities do you increase? Becoming a function of these species-specific benefit parameters, but is like punchline, and if it's hard to read here, this is essentially the same formulation of the problem. But his punchline argument is why this is, should be thrown out the window, again, in 1992, was that we're never going to find out anything about these species-specific benefit parameters, so we just like ignore this exercise altogether. It's, not even useful as a toy model. We should just go for the thing that we can actually measure, which is evolutionary distinctiveness. Now, me reading this in like 2012, 2014, sometime in grad school, going like, hold on a second, this thing called like the credibility revolution happened, where like difference in differencing through different problems. Why can't we like come up with some natural experiments that help us learn about these parameters? And obviously there are going to be challenges with going out and manipulating ecosystems at a large scale, at a meaningful level that allows us to learn about these. But there are all of these things like invasive species, eradication campaigns, reintroducing species, wildlife diseases, any other kind of like sharp, sudden, unexpected change to the abundance and presence of a species constitutes as a potential natural experiment that approximates this like, unfeasible and clearly unethical RCT. Okay, if that's what we want to do, if that's the path that we want to go down, why is it, why did that previous slide make it sound a lot easier than it actually is? Well, as a, at the start, let's just say that ecology as a field has a few more details it definitely needs to iron out. You might all think that like a species as the fundamental unit of study of the discipline is probably a super well-defined concept that we understand really well. Well, there are probably four broad approaches as to how to think about what a species is. You might be more familiar with that first one there, but it's not the only one. Okay, so four broad approaches. How bad can it get? With those four approaches, you have anywhere from 16 to 32 different definitions of what a species is. Okay, and this is again just like the fundamental unit of study of the discipline. What are like 32 different definitions among friends? Okay, but let's say we've chosen our most desirable definition. We all agree on it. Great. Let's talk about diversity now. Wait, are you talking about diversity within the system, across systems, or the entire assemblage of systems? Essentially alpha, beta, or gamma diversity? Are you looking at evolutionary history? Are you looking at taxonomic diversity? Do you only care about the functional traits? Okay, so that's like in the camp that still like holds value to the concept of biodiversity, arguing about like what is the correct way to measure. And during my postdoc, I did this in an ecology lab, and I definitely, was a fly on the wall when they argued about like the alpha diversity is the correct one. Like, oh, don't tell me you're a beta diversity kind of scientist. Like this is very much still a live argument in the field. And there yet the people just says it like this entire concept of biodiversity is just wrong. It's like this like weird buzzword. We should just let go of it. We can't really measure it. We can't agree what it means. It's not helping us move forward with tackling the actual conservation problems that we're trying to solve. Which to some degree also explains why, unlike with climate change where we sometimes have goals that are like, this is the concentration of CO2 we should have, or this is the amount of warming on average that we should think of as the limit. We don't have a biodiversity level that's like considered the optimal level. We state targets more in the sense of like, what is the extinction rate that we think is defensible or reasonable? What is some intact level of biodiversity relative to some baseline? What are some umbrella protections we can apply by protecting areas? Okay, but even if you've chosen your alpha, beta, gamma diversity and you've chosen how to measure it, there are all of these really big debates that almost made it sound that we didn't even get that first report by IPBES because they couldn't even agree like who should have a seat at the table. And this all of the usual kind of lines of argumentation of like global north versus global south. Okay, but then it's also obviously we need natural scientists in the room. Do we make room for social scientists? Do we make room for the humanities to opine about biodiversity? What is the role of non-academics? Okay, there was let's say quite a bit of a kerfuffle around the formation of that first report. But let's set aside all of those high-level conceptual problems. Let's say we have agreed about what we want to measure and how we want to measure it, and we've agreed who should be doing the measurements. We don't have a lot of good measurements, okay? And so unlike with climate change, where you can kind of go back and know what the temperature was like decades ago, centuries ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we barely have good snapshots today of what wildlife population levels are. If we do have good snapshots, they're mostly concentrated in very high-income countries, and the problem is they're a snapshot. They might be in very specific place once, and that's it. That's all we know about that specific species and that specific location. And move out of America and Europe, basically, you kind of have a much darker, or in this case, lighter sense of just what's happening with species. I want to highlight that there are two key exceptions to this. The first one is birds. So in North America, we have the North American Breeding Bird Survey. In the EU, we have the Breeding Bird Atlas. They both provide us with pretty good measurement over time about bird species. The North American one is annual, pretty good coverage since the 2000. The European one is 2 good snapshots in the 90s and more recently. And outside of high-income countries, you get eBird, not as rigorously collected, but at least something that tells you, and there are ways to adjust and account for the endogenous effort in collecting data in that platform. But there's this something on birds that we go and observe and collect and document that provides some useful proxy for the health or the functioning of the ecosystem. The other is fish. And because they're like a resource that gets sold, we do a pretty okay job with like tracking how much it is we catch, depending on who you ask. We do an okay job with like trying to assess what is the actual population size and like are we over harvesting or not. But again, this is going to apply mostly to high income countries that have the capacity to collect the data and make those assessments. And making comparisons between countries is going to be trickier because there are potentially really big schools of thought as to how to make those kind of comparisons. Okay, just to tie things together, like about the challenges between like climate change and biodiversity and ecosystems, I've told you about like the data issues, how there are like these different targets that are expressed, how there's like one report on biodiversity, 6 about climate change, but I want to like leave you with a bit more optimism about like how some new emerging technologies might help address a lot of these measurement issues. I won't cover this in detail. This is just saying like we're observing a lot of stuff from space. We have been observing for quite a few years. We're observing a lot more, throwing a lot more sensors out there that are capturing a bunch more stuff. That is not exactly biodiversity, that is not exactly ecosystem functioning, but offers pretty good proxies for that, and that can be correlated with some ground truth data. I told you a lot about how we're not really getting good ground truth data. We have just like snapshots, not repeating over time, but that's changing due to technologies like the idea of like bioacoustics, like put microphones in the forest, eavesdrop on different species. Either you can pick up the exact species that's vocalizing, or you can build these different environmental indices, like how much of the sound frequencies, soundscape, okay, which is like just the landscape of sound, how many of these frequencies are occupied? Are species vocalizing in every single range of those? If not, why are we missing that group of species there? What happened? And that's a way to essentially like compress petabytes of data into like a single number that we can track over time. And the cost of these microphones is already pretty cheap and declining over time. These innovations with like edge computing, that like the processing happens out in the forest where the microphone is, and then over like a SIM card, you just send that summary number back to some lab. All of this means that we're going to see a lot more of these type of data. Environmental DNA is the idea that we go and do forensics on the environment. We either collect soil and water samples, we take air filters from air monitoring stations, we send drones out to trees or wherever to collect samples, bring them to the lab, sequence the DNA. DNA sequencing costs have gone down by orders of magnitude. You can essentially do it at home now with like cardboard and cleaning supplies and watching a video on YouTube. And it's gotten ridiculously easy to do this at scale. And it tells us again something about like the presence of species, even if they don't vocalize, that we can't like eavesdrop on them with microphones. Another way is to use these camera traps, which is by no means new, and it is more expensive to place these cameras and retrieve the data from them. But what has changed recently is all of our machine learning machinery that can like on the fly process millions of these images and tell us that that's an armadillo, that's a fox, that's like an orangutan, and like instead of people having to do that manually. So all of these technologies are going to, I think, contribute a lot more to trying to just provide us a baseline that we can start to understand what it is we're managing when we're managing these ecosystems and biodiversity. Okay, that was a lot of fire hosing on my part. Let me try and land the plane down with just 3 examples. 2 I'll go over briefly because they're published. You can read the papers if you care about. And I just want to make a comparison between them at the end. And 1 that's of more a work in progress that fingers crossed, if I get my co-authors to sign off on the paper, we're releasing to the public at the end of this month. So this idea, we talked a lot about substitution of like using using human-made inputs as a substitute for natural inputs. Bats, especially those that eat insects, which is predominantly what we have in the United States, have been providing a whole lot of biological pest control, which potentially allows farmers to use less insecticides. We're worried about insecticides as we're worried about pesticides broadly, as they are toxic compounds by design. Ecologists have for a long time predicted that if bat populations were to decline, that massive loss of biological pest control would spell out that farmers would have to compensate and use more insecticides. That's a pretty bold claim. We don't know what else might be changing in the ecosystem. We don't know if farmers even pay attention to the pest pressure. They might just be like spraying the same amount year after year. Can we see whether this holds in the data? For obvious reasons, you do not go and suggest to an institutional review board, can I go out and just manipulate, which is a fancy word of saying killing a lot of bats at random across North America to see what happens. But this condition known as white nose syndrome, caused by an invasive fungal species, provided exactly that. The origin of the name comes from those white flakes on the nose of the bat. That's the fungus growing, essentially eating away at the top layer of its skin. It causes bats to wake up prematurely during hibernation. That essentially spells a death sentence for them, and averaging a mortality rate of 73, but it goes as high as like 99, 100% of some species in some locations. What is useful or rare with this natural experiment is that this fungus just like completely unexpectedly emerged in 2006, and since then it started spreading by county, by the bats flying, migrating, and contaminating other bats, or hikers unknowingly introducing the spores of the fungus into new caves, even really far away from where they were. Just to showing you the ceiling instead of the floor of the cave, what happens when white nose syndrome reaches a new place. It takes a cave from like some baseline level of population and very quickly shrinks it down to effectively close to nothing. Okay, so even if there are like a few bats still in the cave, functionally speaking, they're no longer eating those many insects. And so what I do is I compile data on pesticides, focusing on insecticides, and document that in the years after the arrival of white nose syndrome, we're seeing this increase in insecticide use. As I said, we're in environmental economics. We use infant mortality as an indicator for the contamination and the health impact of different pollutants. Same thing here, we see this increase in infant mortality rates in the years after the arrival of white nose syndrome. These confidence intervals are somewhat wide. What we can do is pool these post-exposure coefficients into 2 years instead of 1, and kind of like ignore the pre-trends if we think that they're okay. Include a bunch of different time trends to try and make this kick the tires more and make this more rigorous and robust. You'll notice there are no stars in this table. I ascribe to the camp that doesn't think that as a discipline we have shown the necessary maturity to use stars in regression tables. It puts the onus on you to actually evaluate what is the precision of the estimates. Some journals have adopted this approach, some let people do what they want. I think that good science does not change discontinuously from good to bad at the threshold of like 5% of a p-value. That's why I take that approach. Okay, and I'll skip this. I'll tell you about a different paper looking at the decline of vultures in India, joined with Anand Sudarshan. So we talked a lot about how to allocate conservation resources. Do we go and allocate them to the most charismatic species, the one that inspire us to write such poems? It might work, but not all potentially useful species are necessarily charismatic. Okay? And vultures are incredibly useful because they've evolved over evolutionary timelines to eat and remove dead animals at scale. A pack of vultures can descend on a carcass of a cow and consume it down to the bone in less than an hour. It can do so safely because its stomach is more acidic by a factor of 10 or 100. Essentially think of vultures as spraying bleach on the environment. They're just disinfecting the environment for us. In India, our farmers have very much relied on farmers for this. In a country with 500 million livestock animals, throwing out dead animals at animal landfills and waiting for the vultures to come and pick them up has provided a huge public good. If vultures were to decline for some unexpected reason, we're concerned both about the greater availability of dead animals and bacteria and pathogens leaching to drinking water, or the fact that like they might get substituted by an inferior scavenger like dogs and rats that do come into contact with people and can spread infectious diseases, especially with dogs. Rabies is a key concern in India. Unfortunately, in our setting, vultures went from being everywhere across the country to declining in just a few short years by up to 99%, very quickly due to the use of this painkiller in livestock animals that was very safe to use in humans, very effective to use in livestock animals. Unknowingly, vultures, when they digest an animal, dead animal with residue of that painkiller, develop kidney failure and die within weeks. Since 2006, India has unsuccessfully banned the veterinary use of the drug, but essentially the country has lost anywhere from 30 to 50 million such vultures. What I'm plotting for you here is just showing this massive collapse in the price of the drug and the explosion, almost a tenfold explosion in sales of the injectable forms of the drug around the time that the generic application to produce it was approved. The reduction in price made it economically viable for livestock farmers to start administering. That was like the big change in the mid-90s. That's also around the time where we start seeing the share of observations in different records of these vultures starting to decline from like some pretty relative baseline. And what we do in the paper is we divide districts in the country to places that we think are going to be more affected or less affected by it due to factors like how much of the habitat range overlaps with the district, and also how much livestock agriculture there is at baseline. We look at mortality data at the district level annually, and here just plotting that we don't see them diverging until like the places that are highly suitable or less suitable to vultures, we only see them starting to diverge around the time that vultures start to decline. Throwing a regression on this and putting standard errors on all of this shows us that, again, no systematic difference in how these districts are trending over time until vultures start declining. We see this divergence opening up and saturates around 2000 when they were all listed as critically endangered and essentially were 99-95% of their previous levels. I want to tie these two papers together by saying, look, two different species in two different settings decline for two very different reasons. Okay? Both of them have had a negative impact on human health. In one case of vultures, we could have substituted for them by burying the dead animals, by building incinerators for them, or by vaccinating feral dogs against rabies. We didn't do that because that was super expensive to do. In the case of bats, we could have replaced the fact that they were eating a lot of insects by using more insecticides, and we did because this was a common agricultural input in a somewhat high-income setting. So in one case, the fact that we didn't substitute was the key problem. In another case, the fact that we did substitute provided the key problem. So this highlights that there's a bit more nuance about the idea of substitution and sustainability that Salo made. I have, I think, a minute. So I'll tell you briefly only about one other project, just to show you that there are different methods you can throw over these other than a difference in differences, and also not every story is necessarily a sad one. So this is joint work with Anush Misirian, Dominic Parker, and Jennifer Rayner, where we think about what have we potentially lost by almost eradicating wolves globally and driving them to extinction. Wolves are important because they prey and deter animals. In their absence, we've eradicated them from many places. We've come up with different alternatives on how to substitute for them, either robots or painting antlers of deer. There was a previous paper that showed that in Wisconsin, when wolves recolonized, there was a decline in collisions with animals. And we look at the St. Lawrence River in Quebec, where wolves are present in the north but not south of the river, and essentially take 20 years of data on vehicle collisions to find that there's a big drop of about 4 percentage points, roughly 30% decline around the border of the river in animal-related collisions. I'll leave you with with a final thought about. There's a lot that economists can say about this field, and I think we have a lot to contribute. both through causal inference and also thinking about the trade-offs inherent about how to allocate these conservation resources. But I definitely am not going to let you leave the room without the answer to the question that has plagued the minds of the internet for the past week or two. Who will win in a fight against the gorilla? 100 men or the gorilla, okay? People came up with like their dream wish list of who they're going into the fight with. And this brought out from the woodwork all of these like ecologists that specialized for years in studying primates. So like, I'm uniquely qualified. I've trained all of my life to answer this question. The gist is 100 men will win, but the gorilla will take out the first 10, 20, 30, depending where it is on the skill and stamina distribution. Don't volunteer to be the first wave of attack. Okay? And with this brought out the game theorists by saying like, okay, so this fight is never going to happen, because even though 100 men will win, no one will agree to be in the first wave, so no, this fight will never occur, so they won't win. Okay, so even in a question like this, economists get to have the last word. Thank you very much.